introduction after Michael's talk. I should also add that, of course, it's a privilege for me to do my PhD in learning, but also I did it at the time when I was preparing for the Gifford lectures. It was like 1982-83, and they were very stimulating seminars and discussions with philosophers, psychologists, mathematicians, computer scientists, linguists. And I just say I grew up in that environment, and that has shaped my research career since then. And I feel that it was a very privileged time for me. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pick up this theme that Michael opened his talk with about the sort of naive view of, well, he talked about, of course, like we look at the sky and the earth, like earth stays still, the sun rises from the east and sets in the west and things like that. And I'm going to look at that, the soul from that kind of naive view, and just give you a little glimpse of the history of people who tried to search for soul. Okay? It's actually a very fascinating topic, and there are books about it, but I'll just give you a little glimpse of it. Okay, so from a very naive point of view, people as soon as people were there, people died, right? So this is one problem. So somebody is alive and active, and then they are dead, okay? And people try to figure out what happens. So what happens when a person dies, And so one possible explanation is that we posit some physical object or energy that causes life, and we can call it soul. But once you posit that, a number of questions arise. For example, can soul be measured, observed in some way? Where in the body does the soul reside? What happens to the soul when a person dies? And where does the soul come from when a person is born? And these are very common sense questions. You can think about it, and I'll just try to show you a glimpse of what people try to come up with an answer to that. So one of the very basic questions is how to measure the soul. I don't know if you know about this guy, McDougall. At the turn of the 20th century, so around 1910 or a little bit before, he actually did a number of experiments near Boston, in a little town called Haverhill. It was a nursing home where old people were there, and then he would wait for them to die, and then he would measure them. Okay? That what happens when after they die, do they lose any weight or something like that? Very interestingly, he actually came up with the weight of the soul. I don't know if you know that. It was 3/4 of an ounce, so 0.75 ounce. An ounce is 28 grams approximately. So 3/4 of an ounce is 21 grams. You might have seen the movie. There's a movie with that title actually. It's a metaphorical movie. It's really not directly about soul. But anyway, so that was his attempt to measure a soul. There have been later attempts actually. So there was this guy, Lewis Hollander Jr. In Oregon in 2000, so not so long ago. He tried to measure the soul of 8 sheep, 3 lambs, and a goat. And then I want to tell you this very recent one. This guy, Bernard Nahum. Actually, I tried to find him again. He used to be at Duke University Medical School, but I tried to look him up again where he is now, but I couldn't find it. But he's actually looking at a very sort of thermodynamics approach and figure out the sort of measure soul in some way. This is actually a quote from one of his papers, that soul is the obligatory negative entropy energy weight equivalent that is necessary to allow for the non-equilibrium meta-stable physical quasi-steady state of a living conscious biological system. Okay? So this again to point out that people have been trying to measure it and figure out some way to quantify or get some trace of the soul. There also have been some other attempts to take photograph of the soul or somehow measure soul in another way besides weighing. So for example, Herbert Carrington, he has this book called The Story of Psychic Science, and he tried to design a machine to reveal the shape of the soul. And there have been other approaches like Charles Russ, and people have tried to make this what is called a fluviograph, so which is actually takes a photograph of the soul. And then the Russian couple, Semyon and Valentina Kirilian, in 1950s, they also devised various ways to measure, or sorry, take pictures of the soul. And then, and of course, there's a whole lot of research on like ectoplasm, which is some kind of material, spiritual material that people. Each of these actually has a very fascinating long history. Some of this is actually bad science, but okay. So, other question is that where does the soul reside? So here are just some. Again, I will give you some sampling of that. So, for example, there is this Midrash, I think he was a rabbi or something, and he came up with this loose bone, and the evidence was that they tried to destroy that loose bone and they tried to burn it or put it on an anvil and heat it or something like that, and they could not destroy it, at least with the means they had. So they concluded that that must be the soul because the premise was that the soul is indestructible. Then, of course, there is Herophilus and Galen, then Leonardo da Vinci. He claimed that the soul resided in spinal medulla, and Descartes thought that it was at the pineal gland. Now, I should actually say that a lot of these, the methodology they used was basically to detach that part of the brain and figure out if the person is still conscious or not. So, for example, this last one, Guido della Pieroni, what he did, he had a case of a patient who was a boy who was unconscious and he had some brain injury, and when they looked at it, they found that in his corpus callosum there was pus accumulated, and when they drained the pus, the boy suddenly woke up. So they said, oh, something is going on here, and then the pus accumulated again, and then he became unconscious again. They drained the pus, and the boy woke up again. And then he actually did an experiment. He put saline water in the cavity, and when he put the saline water, he became unconscious again. They drained the saline water out, so he woke up again. So based on that evidence, he concluded that the soul must reside in the corpus callosum where that cavity is. Now, what happens to the soul after death? So I think again, Michael touched on it a little bit. One premise one can take, or a lot of religions make, is that soul is indestructible. So there are these theories of reincarnation. And I just wanted to mention actually that there are actually some very serious-minded people doing research on that. It's inconclusive at the moment, at least as far as I could tell. So for example, in India, there is a Center for Survival and Reincarnation Research. And because in India, there are a lot of cases people report of reincarnation, and they really go around and try to really collect evidence, and they try to apply this scientific methodology. For example, a lot of times, like for example, somebody might say that this child remembers such and such thing, but it's not really clear that if the child is really remembering it or the child is being primed because of the parents are telling something like that. So they are very strict, so they try to examine each case and then trying to collect if they can find some real evidence for reincarnation. There are a couple of other books. For example, Ian Stevenson, he wrote this interesting book called Biology and Reincarnation. And some of you may know about Brian Weiss. You find him in popular psychology book. And one of his books is called Same Soul, Many Bodies. I should say I personally know some neurologists actually. I've worked with, they are a great believer in reincarnation based on their own personal experiences with some patient or something like that. Brian Weiss is also like that. In his very first book, he describes in great detail an experience he had with a patient, and that kind of made him turn around, and he has written a lot of books about reincarnation and all. So another question is that where does the soul come from? And this is also actually an interesting history because Aristotle thought that man's semen supplied the soul, just because it's active and it's moving, it's dynamic. Then William Harvey, he thought that the female egg had the soul, and because of the shape, it's round, and the semen just like activates it or something like that. And then there was this Dutch scientist, Leeuwenhoek. And it was very interesting because at the time when he was working there, he actually had, they had just developed microscope. So he looked at the semen, the ones like sperm cell, and then he found this like little things in there, and they looked like to him, like a human body or something like that. So he concluded that this is like a what is called a preform of a human body, and hence that actually is the soul. And actually after that, there's a whole literature on this preformation theory, somehow that idea that the form is in the sperm cell, and that form gets bigger when, and the egg only has the material to make that form grow. And there was a lot of debate between ovists versus spermists. And then most recently, I want to point out this Norman Ford has an interesting book, Where Did I Begin? And he claimed that the personhood becomes after 14 days. And it comes from the sort of this, sort of scientific attitude that he wants to show that, or he wants to measure the time after which the division of the cell into twin cells is no longer possible. Because if, like after 1 week, a cell can still divide, and then you can have twin child, and then, but then the two persons are created. So if there's only one soul, then you have a problem that how can a soul be divided into two souls, okay? So anyway, that's the principle, or the thing he came up with. And then, of course, I'll just skip this, how to communicate with the soul. There's a whole lot of literature, a lot of, it is like hocus pocus, but there is some serious research also about mediums. People try to do telecommunication with ghosts or or past souls and things like that. And again, same guy, Brian Weiss, he actually has this, he actually has a very interesting, he had created a very interesting ontology. So he has this alternate universe where the souls are there after death before they are reincarnated. And if you can tap onto that souls, you can get a lot of very useful advice and things like that, you know. I don't know, very interesting. Okay. The point of all this is that people are fascinated with the idea that there might be some substantive object that gives rise to life, and one can attach some normative human-like attribute to it also, so that the soul becomes essentially human. Because notice that when you do it like that, then you can say the animals do not have the soul, but only humans have the soul. Okay? So the experiments done with the sheep and stuff are, then they will not be measuring the soul. Okay, now I just want to compare that with a quick detour on this, the notion of personhood, to connect with this, like how our notion of person evolved, because normally you think that the notion of person is a very simple notion, that, well, a person is a person. And I just want to show you that it's not so simple. So take, for example, this is a Fifth Amendment from the US Constitution. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury and whatever. The key word is person here. Now again, I should say that, you know, normally people think of America as a land of liberty and freedom and whatever. But this clause person is actually, what did they mean by person? So here is actually a actual case from 1879 between Standing Bear, who was one of the Native American chiefs, and General Crook. And so basically that he was arrested, and they were going to deport him to the reservation that they had, US government had set aside for Native Americans. And then this lawyer came up with, well, what was considered to be a very creative argument. And the argument was that this Standing Bear is a person, okay? And so, so this is the argument that the judge agreed that I must hold that Indians and consequently the relators are persons such as described by and included within the laws before quoted. Okay? So again, the point I'm making is that from a legal point of view, this was considered a very creative step, that the concept of person is applied to Native American, because it was not, they were not included in the, of course, the related issue is abortion. I already talked about this book by, you know, how the soul starts after 14 days. But if you look at the, you know, like fetal development, from the conception to the birth, there are gradually the things develop, and the question is that where does the life begin? Or so of course when the baby is born, then all the rights are to the baby, and again you can see that, for example, you know, sometimes it's the third semester that people consider, or legally people consider that you cannot abort. Like church might say that the life begins at conception and things like that. So it's basically a continuum, and you know, legally or wherever you can draw some, you can decide some principle, like for example, when the twinning is no longer possible or whatever. Okay, and okay, and then again to show about this personhood issue, that if you look at the US history of voting rights, so again coming back to that person issue, that for example initially only white males who owned land or taxable wealth were allowed to vote, so they were the only kind of persons. Then it became white males. Then African Americans were allowed to vote in 1870, women in 1920, and person 18 years of age or older was 1971, which was actually after the Vietnam War, because then people protested that, you know, when you are 18, you could actually go and fight the war for the country and you could die, but you were not allowed to vote. And so there was something, you know, so after that, another amendment was made to allow them to vote. The voting age was lowered from 21 to 18. And again, this to tell you that about this personhood, if you look at the literature, especially in the 19th century, and you can look at very famous philosophers, including Kant and other people, that you know, people have struggled with this notion of personhood. So, for example, like when in the 19th century, when Europeans were making contact with like Africans and Asian, they looked different and their habits were different. They spoke different language. Sometimes their culture was different. And they had a hard time trying to reconcile the notion of a personhood. Are they persons? Are they inferior? What are they? And you know, so even like very well-respected philosophers, they tried to figure out, you know. So if you might have known about this phrenology, for example, that was developed, that people looked at the shape of the skulls of African people and they said, oh, they have these 3 bumps there, therefore they are inferior or something like that. Anyway, the point is that, so what I was showing you with the example of person is that the concept of person has evolved, and I could say that in some way it is still evolving. You know, we are trying to get to the stage where we want to recognize everybody as a person, or every human being as a person, doesn't matter of their race or gender or things like that. That's the ideal we are trying to go for. And the concept of soul is sort of similar. You know, it's a cognitive construct. So as our knowledge is expanding, the notion of soul is also changing. And as you can see in the modern scientific debate, it is very closely related to the concept of self and consciousness, and how we, you know, how we kind of think about ourselves and who is conscious, who is not conscious. Do animals have consciousness? Do babies have consciousness? And things like that. Okay. So with that thought, I say thank you.